This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Phyllis Makau, Kenya's first Parliamentary Budget Officer. Welcome to Human Coined.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So why don't we start, maybe you could just start by telling us a bit about the current role of the Parliamentary Budget Office, and then we'll go back into the time that you were the office holder of the PBO.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying that when you hear of the Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya, you think of a think tank that is independent, that provides professional, non-partisan advisory to the legislature on matters, budget, and the economy. That's basically in a nutshell what I would describe the role of the Parliamentary Budget Office in Kenya. An office that has cut out itself in terms of scrutiny of whatever proposals that become before the legislature, giving an independent opinion and giving advisory in form of options and creating a link between the legislature and the executive and other think tanks in the country, and sometimes international. That's what I would think the major role is. Yes.
That's perfect. And let's talk about the evolution of the PBO, because of course now around the world, we're seeing more and more PBOs sprouting up, so to speak. Let's talk about the evolution of the Kenyan PBO. And I think you want to go back and start with the even the underlying preconditions that predated the PBO's founding, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you very much. I would just want to take the clock a little bit back. The Parliamentary Budget Office started in 2007. And when we talk about its evolution, we recognize 5 key major pillars. The first one was the political independence or independence of the parliamentary legislature in terms of having authority to create its own structures and recruit its own staff. And that started in the year 2000 after the repeal of the Constitution, which recognized the Parliament as the third arm of government. What it meant is the Parliament would not wait for the executive to recruit staff and to deploy them to the Parliament. And that was really a major backbone to the Parliamentary Budget Office, because when Parliament thought it should have its own specialized unit, it was able to advertise and competitively recruit. The other pillar that has shaped the Parliamentary Budget Office or its evolution to date is the fact that it also was born from the international experience that was going on in the early 2000s, where legislatures were setting their own Parliamentary Budget Office. You know very well that most of the legislatures, they are either divided on the congressional way or the British, especially in the fact that the House of Commons being replicated where there was a colony of the British. And Kenya was one of them, a member of the Commonwealth. And therefore, it was because they realized also other countries who are members of the Commonwealth, like Uganda, were also having their own specialized unit. And therefore, that international experience, the peer pressure, also gave them an impetus, the need to create their own specialized unit. The other issue was the agitation of the members of parliament wanting to get involved in the budget process. And if you get a chance to read some work I did some times back, tracing the budget oversight of Parliament of Kenya, where we recognize that some years back in 1990s, they had actually called for the budget of State House to review. And when they called that budget of State House to review, immediately the committee, which was called the Budget Estimates Committee, was dissolved by a motion. That was a rider that they needed to have the right people to advise them and to create some authority and using legislation. So that was the other background that made the office be to what it is. And then the other fourth issue was the fact that they had very good support in the beginning from the civil society. It was the civil society who was actually the background work before the budget office came in. And the civil society would actually analyze the estimates and come to discuss with the members and get them to know that if you had your own technical staff, you'd actually do a better job in terms of the analysis of these particular issues. And then, of course, the other pillar when we look at the evolution is the resistance that the executive gave to the parliament. And sometimes I tend to believe when there is a lot of resistance, then the issue becomes more larger and people get to know for it and people start working to achieve it. That is what happened to the Parliamentary Budget Office. And in the National Treasury, where at that time I was working in, we were actually advising the minister there is no need of a duplicate office being established in Parliament. But as it would have it, the day it was advertised, I thought I was the best placed to go and advise them. So I was officer number 1 in the Parliamentary Budget Office. And thereafter,
I appreciate your candor on that too.
Yeah, and after that, I recruited 2 others. And within 2 years, I recruited the fourth officer. And after that, we stayed for 5 years and started agitating until we got 8 more. And then after that, we got the legislation, which was the PFM Act review. And whereas the PFM Act review had a lot of resistance in terms of keeping the budget office there, we fought for it because we were now 14 officers, and we pushed for it until it was enacted. And the very important thing was that law gave us independence in terms of the research we do. And it added one particular function, which has been the biggest achievement, which was providing alternative scenarios. Originally, the members wanted us to put there that the budget office should provide an alternative budget. But we advised them against that and said, no, we should give you options. And therefore, that's some of the issues that part of having to push for it. Those were the issues. Now, this office, as it is today, has certain achievements. One.
I'm just going to interrupt you for just 1 second before we get to the achievements. Can we just back up a little bit? Because I want to go back to the period of 2007 when the office started up, but it was not recognized in legislation. Can you talk, as you know, I've done work in both Zambia and Malawi, 2 countries in which there is a PBO that is not recognized in law. It really is just a function of the parliament forming that unit. Can you talk about how tenuous your role was in 2007 when you didn't have that protection or legal protection of independence, and presumably you were subordinated to the Secretary General of the Parliament or to the Parliamentary Service Commission?
Thank you very much. One important thing is that what drove me to Parliament was the fact that I felt the parliamentarians made decisions without adequate information. And therefore, one of the things I went there was commitment to provide information to the legislatures. So in 2007, the office was called Office of Fiscal Analysis and Appropriation. That was the longest description of an office. But going in there, I had one determination. First, I recruited a tax expert because we needed to have somebody to tell us about taxation. I understand the entire realm of budget issues, but I'm more of expenditure than taxation. So I thought the best thing is to get somebody who's good at taxation. So within 1 month, when I was told, identify an officer to come in, when we called for the interview, I ensured the person who won was actually somebody who was stronger in taxation. So I got somebody who was working in the Kenya Revenue Authority. So I knew I was assured of the issues of the revenue bills when they came in. Then I realized the other issue was to create networks. And because we had the network of civil society, which in 2006-07 was very strong in Kenya. We had a civil society which used to provide an alternative budget. So when we got an officer who was coming from the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya, then I was more poised to ensure that this is a person who will do the legwork of networking. True to it, the three of us were very strong. So when we sat down, being new officers, in the beginning of the financial year 2007 and 8, and that was July when the year had just started, we sat down and we did a work plan. Which work plan, when I look at it, is actually was the best work plan. And in our work plan, one thing we did was to ensure we identify which committee should we be found to go. So we realized that then the budget committee wasn't as strong. But we realized the finance committee, because of taxation, and everybody went there because of tax measures and all that. We worked together with the people called clerks in parliament. We worked with that clerk and we decided we are the assistants. We brought ourselves to be below assistants. She was actually junior to us, but we told her we are your assistants. So when we sat in the committee, we would listen keenly. And when they reach a part of a taxation, through that clerk will say, the Office of Fiscal Analysis has an opinion. And they would tell us, why don't you analyze? And then we would analyze and we come back and make a presentation. And they realized our presentation were very relevant and they could use it to debate in the floor of the House. And that gave us an entry point, which is, in other words, what I tell other PBOs. Visibility was one thing we worked on, being visible. We knew we are not independent. In fact, we were just a small unit, tucked in. We were only four of us. And anytime even anybody came and said, we want to see the Parliamentary Budget Office, we would call people from research to sit with us so as to look like we are 10, 15. They would look like we needed quorum. So we didn't look first for independence. We looked for visibility. And that visibility was based on the information we had. So we would use our network process. So that officer would do legwork, go to the treasury, and using my long friendship with the other officers, we would look for information well in advance. And therefore, when that issue comes before the members, we would already be armed with some analysis. So there are two issues a Parliamentary Budget Office must do. They must become visible. They must create networks. Because you won't get the information unless you have necessary networks. So that's what helps us in 2007. Then finally, when we had the draft law, we were involved in every clause and we will inform the lawyers that this is what you need to change. This is how you need to add. This is the spaces you need to remove so that the executive doesn't reject. And then we told the members that there's something called moral suasion. And in legislation, you will not get everybody approve it, not unless it's a government bill. So we also advise them on how to lobby other members to actually get that passed. At the same time, we try to look for other places for peer learning. And that's why we used to push for the clerk of parliament to take us to Congress to see how it is done. We were able to research on online, and sometimes I like telling people, we introduced a document which said the national government has to bring the budget policy statement, because we're looking for a document that the parliament can engage early on the budget issues. So we Googled and we found out in New Zealand, it is called the budget policy statement. So we coined that name from there. And with a motion in the floor of the House, that became a critical document. And it found itself into the law. So we also midwifed the law. So that's how we started. We didn't start with independence. We started with feasibility.
And let me just clarify, because I think you've raised a very important point, and one that I've mentioned many times in a number of countries. The budget policy statement, which of course in the Open Budget Survey is referred to as the pre-budget statement. So many parliaments around the world are starting their work at the approval phase of the budget. That is, they're waiting until the budget is introduced into Parliament. The actual budget documents are introduced into Parliament to really start their scrutiny. And of course, at the approval phase, time is extremely limited. And so so you're saying that you had a role in introducing the budget policy statement. Was that something that was already being produced by the government, or it wasn't being made public, or it just wasn't being scrutinized? Can you just maybe explain a little bit?
It was actually being produced, but in a different name. It
Okay,
was it was called a different name. But then let me just say this. In fact, in most countries, that document is being produced. Only that is
that's right.
taken together with the estimates. Look at Malawi. Malawi has always produced a fiscal strategy paper, much earlier than Kenya. And therefore, it is a timing issue. For us, we also realized it was the timing issue because it was coming with the estimate. So we said, if it comes with the estimate, it doesn't help anybody. So bring it earlier. So that is the difference. All those countries do have it. The problem is, at what time is it brought to the legislature? So for us, our influence was to indicate that in New Zealand, it's brought 6 months earlier. We never managed to get that. For us, we pushed for 4 months. So that's why it comes in February. So we pushed it for February. And like many countries think you need to have a constitutional change to do those things, for us, we changed it. Then the constitution found us and then constitutionalized it. So that's the difference. So it is there. In Malawi, it is there. It's only that what is the timing? Because in Malawi, it is brought with all the other documents. So that's the difference.
I see. I see. That's great. Um, and what type of analysis were you conducting on the budget policy statement?
Yes. So now when we said the budget policy statement would be the first initial document for the legislature to be involved on it, was because the budget policy statement, by its own features, is supposed to be the policies that inform the itemized budget. So it means if you are in the medium term expenditure framework process, which most countries are in. Some places called the MTBF, that is the medium term budget framework. Whatever it is, it means establishing a link between the policies and the budget in a phased manner. And that's where they talk about the medium
Over a
term.
3 to 5 year period. Yeah.
Yeah, so what we say that if the policies are decided upon and the legislature involved in making the right choices of the policies, then it will mean when we come to the budget itself, it's actually to counter check whether it is in line with what government pronounced itself. And we made a rider. The legislature does not approve the budget policy statement. But it can see recommendations that it can relate to the legislature, to the executive. So the legislature will look at those policies and see whether the policies relate to the national agenda, which national agenda would have been passed long time like a sessional paper. So by checking whether they are in line with that, they are able to say, then if these are the policies, we expect you to come with the following proposed programs. So that is a decision because that's a baseline, really. So our analysis is supposed to be an analysis based on policies and checking whether the policies are in line with the national agenda and whether at the overall macro level, the expenditure proposals and the strategies are going to be in line with those policies. For example, if they are talking of reducing the public debt, then we look at what is a policy on the deficit. And then what is a policy on the overall recurrent expenditure, on overall capital expenditure. Then we are able to inform the legislature that, look, this overall aggregate expenditure is not in line with the policy of fiscal consolidation. So all those issues relate to that. So that's where the discussion is. So when you talk of having mainstreamed the legislature in the budget making process, it means the policy discourse, the legislature gets involved and the voice of the legislature is heard. Whether the executive implements it's another thing, but at least their voice is heard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned briefly the issue of debt. Of course, one of the best practices that I refer to often is the fact that the medium-term debt strategy is tabled in Parliament along with the budget policy statement about 4 months before as you said it before, 4 months before the budget is tabled. Can you talk a little bit about the PBO's role in analyzing the MTDS, the medium-term debt strategy?
the PBO of Kenya has evolved. Originally, the MTDS did not get as much scrutiny analysis by the office as the BPS. So
Yeah.
there was more analysis of BPS, and because also the fact that the way the standing orders were, the standing orders they only provided for the submission of the BPS into the floor of the House for the Parliament to make resolutions. But then later on, in the recent 2 years, or actually about 3 years ago, the standing orders were amended to include MTDS. Before it was not there.
And the
So it
PFM
was,
Act as well, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah,
Public Financial Management Act as well.
yes, the Financial Management Act was inside there, but in terms of the standing order, because the only way to get into the floor of the House is a standing orders to mention here and that. But the standing orders
Yes.
are not as clear as they are right now. So now,
Okay.
what the PBO does is analyzing the BPS. They come to the central government macro outcome. That is what I call the balance sheet of Parliament, of our government. And in that, they are able to see what is the deficit being projected in the medium term. And that deficit, they link it to the medium term debt strategy. And then they are able to write the necessary recommendations. In December 2021, because that's the time the budget policy statement was approved earlier, so that because that was an election year, so we had to do it earlier. The Parliamentary Budget Office made a presentation to the Budget Committee and said the overall deficit was not in line with the MTDS. And there was a stalemate. And if one followed the answer of the House, the budget committee ended up making a recommendation that this budget can't be approved with this deficit because it's not in line with the MTDS. So it had to take a lot of discussions until the resolution which was put there was such that the BPS resolved that the budget can go on to be prepared, but it has to ensure that the deficit is in line with the MTDS.
And that's why the two documents are so important that they be
Yes,
reviewed
that's how
together.
it became very important that they have to talk to each other. So that was a very key departure of ensuring there is a linkage between MTDS and the BPS. There may be some areas where the government may not adhere to what has been proposed, but essentially it's the government of the day. One has to understand there is also the political bit of the economy and the political bit of the budget. But essentially the two documents become very critical for informing the policy decisions.
It's fascinating. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned, if we go back to, before we get to the current impact, if we go back to the original name of the office, you said Office of Fiscal Analysis and Appropriation. Is that what I heard? Did I hear that correctly? Yeah, it's interesting because, there's a number of parliaments that are another number of parliamentary budget offices that are being set up, that are being called parliamentary budget offices, but don't have that independence, like Zambia and Malawi, for example. And I wonder whether it's really fair to call them parliamentary budget offices until they have their independence. Do you think that's just playing with words, or do you think that's there's any merit to that argument?
I tend to think the word Parliamentary Budget Office is because it links the office to Parliament. Office of Fiscal Analysis was also fine, but we felt we were given that name because the executive wanted to push us down. So that's the reason why they push for the name Parliamentary Budget Office. And for many times in Parliament, the office would be misconstrued to be the office that processes interest and vouchers because it's called Budget Office. So everybody imagine Budget Office, you are dealing with payments and the rest. So
The finance department.
yeah, the offices go by different names because in West Africa they are called legislative budget offices. And if you look at the Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya, you can compare it with the Office of Fiscal Responsibility. Those are similar names. The issue is in the names may just mean something else, but I think one wouldn't worry more of the name, but worry more of the outputs of the office and visibility. What is most important is the setup of that office. Because if offer was a little bit like relegating it down, and therefore we needed visibility. The visibility was named Parliamentary Budget Office. You reference about Zambia. Zambia, my own understanding is the Parliamentary Budget Office is a Parliamentary Budget Office. And I think it has the right name. And I think the weak part of most of the Parliamentary Budget Office that I imagine is visibility. And then independence comes next. Independence should be has independence from what? Because at the end of the day, you must be able to report somewhere. So you're either reporting to the presiding officer or you're reporting to the clerk of the parliament or the legislature. And sometimes it's just an individual makeup. If reporting to a speaker is more powerful, well and good. But the Parliament of Kenya, Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya reports to the Clerk of National Assembly administratively. But functionally, they are free because the law provides that they produce the documents. The law doesn't say where they should go, but the law silently, because we also fought that battle of trying to become independent. So we try to provide in the law that for any document to go out, it has to have been presented to either a committee of parliament or to parliament. So in other words, we are giving the authority for approval of those documents to a bigger group outside an individual clerk, outside and speaker. It's not the speaker of parliament who approves the document from Parliamentary Budget Office, neither the clerk. Neither the director doesn't approve. It's only that director must be responsible because should anything be included in that document to be wrong, the director will be responsible. But the responsibility is if one was to take the Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya to court, the issue would be who did you present to as per the law, as per the PFM Act 2012, because that's the issue. So all those other parliamentarians coming out, they need to find out what is the feasibility. Where does their document go to? Is there a website of Parliament where you hang for the entire public to read and see? And for sure, Geoff, that is the reason why many of the Parliamentary Budget Office specifically in Africa, do not find themselves in the classification of independent fiscal councils because they don't communicate their analysis to the public consumption. That's what's critical. Yeah.
Right. And even in the case of Malawi, I learned recently when I was there that the budget committee essentially has to approve the reports of the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Yeah, that's where the problem
is. That strike. Sorry, what's that?
That's where the problem is. The committee does not have, members of parliament.
The expertise question.
Yeah. They are elected based on certain choices of the constituents. So there may be no somebody. They are supposed to approve the budget because the opinion of the budget office should be just an opinion. They can either take it or reject it. So once you say approve it, then the office will have to ensure that they say what the committee likes to say. For the budget office in Kenya, they never say what the committee wants to say. They say it as it is, and then they tell the committee, the choice is yours. They return themselves into a secretariat, and they take notes. Yeah.
And even when you talk about the speaker being required, the speaker being required to approve the PBO reports. I think that's what I heard you say, or the clerk in Kenya being required to approve the reports. That also struck me as abrogating on the independence of the PBO in the sense that they're not free to publish their expertise directly to Parliament. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I think you didn't get me. I said the Parliamentary Budget Office of Kenya, their reports are not approved by the clerk or the speaker.
Okay, they're not approved. Good.
They're not approved.
That makes sense. Okay.
And
Okay.
in fact,
Okay.
the first early days when we would do the report, then we go and present it to a different committee within Parliament, whoever is interested. Then after that, we would hang it in the website. And often the media would pick it and say the office has said. And then
Right.
the system would wake up looking for the PBO. And
Right.
the clerk would ask, who approved the report? And we would say, the law is very clear. Our role is simply to inform the debate
That's
and
right. Yeah.
analysis. So there is that
Yeah.
independence.
And I like your comment about not forming an alternative budget because that's very much that's up to the opposition to form an
Yes.
alternative budget.
Mm. Yes, exactly.
And you're right; it makes sense that the PBO's job is to provide clarity to Parliament as to whether the financial information provided by the government is if they agree with it or disagree with it based on their own professional expertise. To provide another data point, an independent data point from the Ministry of Finance. Can you talk a little bit more about the opposition that the PBO faced in Kenya? Because I think after the PBO Act of or the PBO law of 2009, it took several years for the PBO to get up and running, and I think that was partly because of opposition from the executive branch. Can you talk a bit about that?
Uh, I think the problem with the Parliamentary Budget Office and many others is one, they provide a new skill which never used to exist, and they open up what was never known. For example, after the Parliamentary Budget Office came in place in 2009, the standing orders changed at the same time and provided every vote or every department had to be scrutinized by Parliament. So you can imagine how everybody felt. There used to be a process called guillotine procedure. Guillotine procedure was that you discuss for 11 days a few ministries and then the rest are passed en masse. But with the standing orders, a new office, we said all those departments must be scrutinized by a committee. And a provision was made, a communication was made that before a committee sits to review estimates and discuss with ministries, a parliamentary budget office officer has to brief that committee. That was essentially moving power from one particular area to another. So there has to be internal resistance because now you become very powerful. You walk into the campus of parliament and they are pointing to you, that is a parliamentary budget office. That's a parliamentary budget office which has said this tax shouldn't be done. You would note how many things that the office indicated in a proposal that we think this is not the right way to go. And members go to argue to the floor of the House and actually mentioned the Parliamentary Budget Office. So a lot of resistance grew. But as resistance grew, so did everybody want to be in PBO. So when we advertised for recruitment, everybody wanted to be in PBO. So you'd be surprised. The PBO in 2014 rose to, we got 11 officers and became 21. In 2021, we got 23 new staff. So it is now a strength of 47. And that is actually very big. So at the end of the day, everybody can analyze just 1 minute. So the interest grows when you start keeping people lower. And really, at the end of the day, the resistance was there because of the new things the office was bringing, the shifting of power of the past from the executive to the legislature was one of the biggest resistance. And really, without the budget office, the power wouldn't have been shifted because you needed somebody to crunch the numbers. Those many volumes of books needed somebody to really crunch the numbers. And a lot of reforms was taking place at the same time on budget issues. And really everyone felt this office was becoming too strong, both
And
internally in
we've
parliament and in the
Mhm.
executive.
And I was considering whether I would ask this question or not, but there are countries in the region in which political opponents are not always safe. Those who speak out and question the government, there are times where those people are targeted. So it must be, having a PBO that is openly questioning the government's figures, financial figures, that must be somewhat uncomfortable for some of the senior people who are trying to take that role on.
I think the difference with the PBO of Kenya and what others would imagine to be, the PBO was not an office of opposition. That's one thing. And we
That's right.
viewed ourselves as independent, working on the thin line. We said sometimes what government wanted to hear. And government would be so happy and actually quote and say it, as you have been advised by PBO. So the difference was to ensure that we are not
That's true. Yeah.
weighed on the side of opposition. So nobody will look for a PBO officer because they knew the PBO officer, the analysis. One time we had done an analysis. In an analysis, we put about, and the issue was the status of poverty in the country. And we had said for so many years, more Kenyans were becoming poorer than previous regimes. And of course, one would have thought now that was an attack of the president. The then Minister for Planning gave a call to my office and said, what is the source of your data that you're saying you are likening the current president to have made people more poorer? My answer was this. I'm sorry, Minister, why don't you give us your statistics of the current status of poverty? We will analyze them and give the same opinion. And that changed an about turn. The minister went and ordered for a Kenya household budget survey to be done immediately because of what we had said. We are not blaming anybody. We are saying the numbers as they are. And sometimes it's a language of analysis. Let me give an analogy or rather a comparison. The office of the Budget and Appropriation Committee chair in the US, when the budget comes out, that office will write and say that this budget is dead on arrival. It is bad,
Yes,
it's
that's right.
this, and it's that. But the Congressional Budget Office will analyze and say, this budget, these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. Now you can see the two different reports. So the Budget Office of Kenya traded that part of trying to say we are independent, we are just basing our analysis on the statistics and not an attack on the government, and it's not an attack on opposition of the government. So most of the time, the document was flowing in a manner saying strengths and weaknesses, not really blaming anybody in person. And that's why
I think.
nobody chased for Phyllis anywhere. But my
Well, that's good
my
to hear.
my technical staff, my technical friends in the treasury will give me a call and tell me, Phyllis, you finished us. And I'll say, I didn't finish a human being, I just finished the budget which is in a document. And sometimes it was a cause of discussion. Sometimes we saved each other. To the extent we are such good friends. I'm sure you know the Parliamentary Budget Office where it is situated in Nairobi. It is in a building called Protection House. You you first reach Protection House before you reach Parliament. We became such good friends that as the books of estimates were being delivered to Parliament, they would ensure a set arrives in my office, the Parliamentary Budget Office. And it would be written there on top, Parliamentary Budget Office. And the security down there would see the vehicle from the Treasury with many books, and they would actually help secure parking for the car to deliver a copy to my office. By then, nobody in the country has seen the books. But they had that faith that if I saw something is not right, technically not right, I would give them a call and tell them, please retrieve them, correct this information. Because we are friends, not enemies. We are not fighting. Yeah, that's why. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're right also, I did one of my very first podcasts was an interview with Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. And one of the things that his advice for countries that are just emerging in this with a practice such as forming a PBO, get your officials out of the Treasury, get them from the Ministry of Finance, get people who understand how government works, how the financial system works. How important was that in your context? Sounds like it was very important.
Yes, I must say that that is the same case because at the end of the day, when Kevin Page was appointed the budget officer, it was the same time I was appointed the budget officer in Kenya. So
Right.
we shared a birthday.
Okay. I'm
Yeah.
going to pass that on to him. Yeah. And it's funny because when he became Canada's first parliamentary budget officer in 2006, I think it was, I heard his a speech where he said, "Hi, I'm Kevin Page. I'm Canada's first and possibly last parliamentary budget officer," and that was because again, it's not easy to get a budget office up and running. Let's talk about, in the minutes we have left, let's talk about the impact. You were getting to that earlier, and I sort of cut you off because I wanted to finish the historical part. But let's talk about the impact of the PBO on Parliament. If I were to go into Parliament today in Kenya, what's changed from pre-207 to now, aside from the size of the PBO? How are parliamentarians better served than they were before in terms of budgetary matters?
I think the major impact that took place is that the Budget Office mainstreamed Parliament into the budget process. That is very critical. And how did they mainstream them? They also developed tools that outlived ourselves as the technical staff who have served and who have left at senior level. My deputy left earlier than me. And then I follow now. My recent deputy is the new director. But we've developed several tools. There is a budget analysis tool. There is a macro model tool which does the forecast of various variables. And therefore, the data from the Parliamentary Budget Office is comparable to the one which comes from government. There is a tax forecasting model. So, which means essentially the tools developed can be able to make right advice to the members, and so that when they make a decision, they make a decision from information. Those members of parliament in Kenya who make decisions that have maybe led to rise in public debt have made the decision knowing what are the impacts of that. In fact, you follow their discussions, they'll be indicating this budget is going to lead to higher debt. This and this needs to be done. So, which means they have been informed by projections, this is what is going to happen. So that's one of the issues. The second issue that has been a success by the PBO is transparency. We believe the Parliamentary Budget Office increased transparency in the budget by the virtue of the fact that they crunch the numbers, and there are things which by just at the look at the voluminous documents, one may not really know what is included in those particular items. But they are able to bring them out and for everyone to see. The fact that their reports are hung in the walls of Parliament, they can be read anywhere, anytime, downloaded, and one can actually utilize them to even further understand the budget of the country. So the office is not only beneficial to the legislature, it's also beneficial to the public. The budget has been, there has been a lot of developments in the budget. Right now, they are doing the program-based budgeting, which means a lot of details may not be available to the public. But through the Parliamentary Budget Office, some analysis shed some light into that. And very important, the Parliamentary Budget Office improved the appropriation by Parliament. Kenya is one of those parliaments who do appropriation by program. Many other countries are doing it by vote. In Kenya, it's by program. And one can clearly see how much each program is going to get. And you can link that program to the budget book and say, these are the results. Then one can go and measure and monitor. I think that's the case. But of course, there are areas which the office is still in the process of getting a depth similar to the allocation part, and that is the annual appropriation accounts. That is the public accounts, the reports from the financial statements from ministries. That is still an area not fully developed. And I remember I told my team when I was leaving, that is what I leave with you.
And how much of a role does the PBO play when it comes to the accounts? Is that more the public accounts? Is that more the role of the National Audit Office of Kenya or the Office of the Auditor General of Kenya? Or
when the documents are brought to Parliament, the Parliamentary Budget Office has put in place a system to analyze and advise the members. And that has evolved substantially in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, there's a lot of effort that has been put that area by the Budget Office. More so importantly, not because the Auditor General talks about whether budget was approved, was implemented as approved, and all those issues. But the Parliamentary Budget Office starts linking the actuals with the results which were originally intended, and then does a further analysis in terms of the sectors, the items of spending, just to understand where is the more incidence in terms of avoidance and in terms of misappropriation, which item is more at risk to be misappropriated on. But the analysis is not as in-depth as the analysis of the budget allocations. And that's what we're saying that is the depth that they are now working on and coming up with a system for that.
That's really interesting. We're running out of time, so I just want to mention that I would have liked to have talked to you more about the link between civil society and the PBO, because I have found recently in the work that I've been doing that there is a very natural link. It may not be instinctive when you think about it. If you wouldn't necessarily see the two fitting together, but they do seem to work very well together. Do you have any comments on that you want to make?
Yes, I think first, the civil society is a very good opportunity to actually forge a network between the Parliamentary Budget Office or a legislative office because of the dissemination of the work that the Parliamentary Budget Office does. So that would be a very good network to have and a link to have. Secondly, sometimes civil society is able to gather some information and some analysis that will be beneficial to a parliamentary budget office, especially when the budget offices are being set up, because they always don't have enough skills. Say they want in-depth analysis for health, for infrastructure, for energy, then the civil society can provide that. And actually, that's what we were doing when we were 5 of us. We were actually using civil society to do analysis. Then we provide a forum to them to come and make presentations to the legislature. And that would help us and give us room for doing other things. So that would be one good thing. I think there is something you had raised about gender responsive budgeting.
I'd love to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just say something about that. The Parliamentary Budget Office has made efforts to try to get into that sector of gender responsive budgeting. However, the issue of lack of data was very detrimental because at the end of the day, the government does not submit that data adequately or doesn't keep that data adequate. The furthest we went was to do the in-depth of analysis of education and get to know how many girls are in school, how many boys are in school, how many teachers are men, how many teachers are women. That's the farthest we went. That's the only sector we try to get some data in gender, but in the others, no. And so that is actually still a drawback. The skills are there because staff have been trained, but the lack of that disaggregated data is a major drawback.
And I actually have recently reviewed the appropriations for Kenya, and I think, back in the day, I thought that program-based budgeting was the mecca, that somehow it was the ultimate, it was the best, it was smooth sailing from there. But when you go into the appropriations, that doesn't help you understand how government is allocating funds for the most vulnerable people in the country, for example, or how women are benefiting from the budget. That information is clearly not part of the appropriation. So I can understand your point. Any advice to those who are advocating for stronger?
First, I think by legislation, the executive should be required to give a certificate of how much the budget or the policies have included gender in their proposal. And for that certificate should be accompanied by some form of data. And in addition to that, the things like the programs, the items of spending should have a way of tagging. Tagging means giving some codes so that by one can query, scrutinize, and get a totality in certain areas. And therefore, adequate data should be put in place. And I think that can only be done by passing the necessary legislation. Uganda is the best. It has a Whether it is followed, a different issue, but it has a specific legislation on the certificate and the data required. And perhaps,
That's great.
and in terms of tagging, Rwanda is the best.
Rwanda. I think the last question I'm going to pose is just whether you have any other advice for, or maybe we can summarize your advice for emerging parliamentary budget offices, both in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world. There's a new PBO starting out in Sri Lanka, specifically tied to the debt crisis there. What's your advice to new PBOs?
My advice to new PBOs is that first and foremost, it must be possible to attract a skilled professional staff, somebody with a very good experience in public sector budgeting and matters economy. That's one. And then you can link up other staffs under that. The second issue for a PBO is visibility. Whatever analysis you do must be able to be publicized by presenting to the necessary people, by finding a communication strategy of how to communicate your analysis. So that is very important, number two, of the feasibility. Then number three, creating networks. And networks means not only with the executive, but the civil society and other think tanks in the country. And then fourthly, chase independence through our legislation. That's what I feel. And that's why my priorities should go like that. Don't chase independence first, because you'll never get it. Thank you.
Phyllis Makau, this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we could have continued for the rest of the day, but I really want to thank you for your time. It's been very inspiring talking to you, and I always look to Kenya when I'm doing training elsewhere to look at some of the best practices that have come out of Kenya. So I really do appreciate your time, and it's helped me to learn more about the Kenyan evolution as well on the PBO. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you too. It was nice talking with you.
Take care.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.